You know, usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there is this clear expectation of precision, like engineering, right? You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points a pen at it and says, oh, there it is.
Right. Broken or not broken?
Yeah, it is clean, it is visible, and honestly, it is very comforting. We like things to be visible like that. We like things to be categorized. We can formulate a five-step plan to fix them.
Oh, definitely. We love a system.
But then you look at the modern landscape of spirituality, psychology, and just the human condition in general, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely busted. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. Think about it. You live in a modern world that constantly demands you find yourself. The overarching message of our culture is that you must be the absolute master of your own destiny. You are the captain of your soul. So naturally, we want an x-ray that just shows us how to fix our self-esteem, how to optimize our morning habits, how to manifest our best possible lives.
Right. We basically want a religion that operates like a high-end life coach.
Precisely. But the text we are looking at today asserts the absolute opposite of all those cultural assumptions. So, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today's deep dive investigates two rigorous theological treatises analyzing the words of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Specifically, we're looking at verses 14 and 15.
And the argument laid out here is staggering. It asserts that true Christian existence means your right to self-rule has been utterly, legally executed. Yeah. And far from being a tragedy, you are now happily constrained by someone else. That tension between self-rule and absolute submission is the core issue here. It presents a reality the natural human mind furiously rebels against.
Because it sounds entirely restrictive to modern ears.
It does. So our goal for this conversation is to trace Paul's logic from the historical event of the cross all the way to the total conquering of human autonomy. We are going to demonstrate from these treatises that the gospel, as presented in these specific verses, is not a tool for self-improvement.
It's not a life hack.
No. It is a hostile takeover by a resurrected king. Paul is setting up a legal, objective reality here. The substitutionary death of Christ on behalf of his chosen people executes the old self. It puts a definitive end to the tyrannical rule of self-preservation.
And that action binds the elect to an entirely new, Christ-centered existence.
Yeah, the objective, finished work of Christ acts as an inescapable force. It shuts down all options for a self-directed life. But to comprehend this, we really have to grasp the mechanics of substitution, the nature of federal headship, and the total claim of the resurrected monarch over every faculty of the redeemed individual.
Okay, let's slow down and unpack this piece by piece. Because to really grasp why Paul's message was so radical, and why it still is today, we have to look at who he was talking to. We need to reconstruct the environment.
What he do? Context is everything here.
Right. We aren't talking about a quiet, contemplative monastery full of monks taking vows of silence. He was writing to the city of Corinth around AD 55 or 56. And from the historical data in the text we reviewed, this place was a hyper-competitive, flesh-driven atmosphere. It actually bears a striking resemblance to a modern, bustling metropolis.
It really does.
Can you paint a picture for us? What would it actually look, smell, and feel like to walk the streets of Corinth back then?
Well, physically, Corinth was strategically positioned on a narrow isthmus. It was this strip of land connecting mainland Greece with the Peloponnese Peninsula.
Okay.
And this specific geography gave the city control over two massive harbors. You had Lenaeon on the Corinthian Gulf facing west toward Italy.
Right.
And Cenchrea on the Saronic Gulf facing east toward Asia. Because of this layout, it was an absolute juggernaut of a commercial hub. Ancient merchants were terrified of sailing around the treacherous southern coast of Greece.
Because of the weather.
Yeah, shipwrecks were incredibly common down there. So instead, they would literally drag their cargo ships across the land bridge on a paved stone trackway. It was called the Diolkos.
Wait, they dragged the actual ships across the land?
They did. Consequently, the city was perpetually flooded with a transient population. Sailors, traders, freedmen, hucksters, and wandering philosophers from every corner of the Roman Empire were constantly moving through the streets.
So it was basically the ancient equivalent of an airport terminal mixed with Wall Street. Just constant motion, money changing hands, and a massive clash of cultures.
That is a highly accurate comparison. And because of that massive influx of wealth, it was a culture defined by gross materialism, intense status seeking, and just relentless social display.
Very much like today.
Very much. They also hosted the Isthmian Games every 2 years. These were massive athletic and rhetorical competitions dedicated to the cult of Poseidon. They were second only to the Olympics in prestige.
Oh.
Yeah. Winners received crowns of pine or celery, but more significantly, they won immense social capital. The whole city was geared toward competition. Furthermore, towering 1,000 feet above the city was the Corinth.
What was that?
It was this monolithic rock fortress housing the notorious Temple of Aphrodite, which heavily influenced the moral climate of the city. The entire society prized rhetorical elegance, visual prestige, visible wealth, and ruthless personal self-promotion above all else.
So into this Vanity Fair walks the Apostle Paul,
Mm-hmm.
and he is trying to establish a church. But he's not the only voice there. The material introduces this group of antagonists that Paul sarcastically labels the super apostles.
Yeah.
Let's talk about these guys. Who were they, and how are they managing to turn the Corinthian church against Paul?
These super apostles were counter-missionaries. They arrived in Corinth specifically to challenge Paul's authority and essentially hijack the congregation. They showed up armed with glowing letters of recommendation from influential people, basically brandishing their ancient academic credentials. They constantly boasted of their pure Hebrew heritage, framing themselves as the true insiders.
So they looks good on paper.
They looked great on paper. But their primary weapon was their claim to possess magnificent spiritual experiences. They boasted of ecstatic visions, miraculous displays, and direct, spectacular communications from the divine.
So it's very flashy theology.
Yes, they operated with a theology of glory. They argued that true divine favor equates to visible success, rhetorical brilliance, and financial prosperity. They looked at the wealth of Corinth and adapted their message to fit the culture perfectly. As such, they demanded heavy monetary compensation from the Corinthians.
Really? They charged for it?
Oh, yeah. They were effectively selling their spiritual authority, which the culture actually respected. People in Corinth assumed that if you charged a high fee for your teaching, you must be a premium commodity.
And I imagine Paul did not fit that premium commodity mold at all.
He was the exact opposite. And they ruthlessly attacked him for it. They mocked his unimpressive physical appearance. They ridiculed his lack of professional rhetorical polish. Paul deliberately did not speak like the trained theatrical sophists they admired.
He kept it simple.
Mm-hmm. Most viciously, though, they pointed to Paul's frequent beatings, his imprisonments, his shipwrecks, and his poverty as absolute proof that he lacked God's blessing.
Wow. They weaponized his suffering against him.
They did. They argued that a true apostle, a man genuinely favored by God, would never suffer so miserably. They even went so far as to call Paul mad or beside himself for his radical devotion and his willing embrace of public humiliation.
Let's translate this into our current cultural currency, because the analogy is almost too perfect. Think about these super apostles as modern-day social media influencers or prosperity preachers. We all know the type.
Right here.
They operate out of mega studios with million-dollar lighting rigs. They wear tailored designer suits. They casually post photos from the tarmac standing next to private jets.
Mm-hmm.
And they equate visible wealth and slick aesthetic presentation with divine blessing. Their entire brand is built on presenting a flawless, victorious, highly optimized life.
And the algorithm rewards that.
Right. The algorithm rewards their aesthetic perfection, and the audience assumes that because they have millions of followers, a massive compound, and immense wealth, God must be endorsing their message.
Yeah.
Then you look at Paul. He is small, likely physically scarred from being stoned and whipped. He works third shift, making tents out of rough leather with his bare hands, just to fund his own bivocational ministry.
Right. He's a blue-collar worker.
Yeah. He is completely lacking in any sort of public relations strategy. By every metric the culture values, he looks like a massive failure. So here is my question for you. If the culture back then evaluates leaders based on visible status and rhetorical polish, just like our culture does now, how does Paul mount a defense without just stooping to their level and bragging about his own resume? How does he prove his authority without playing their game?
He completely changes the parameters of the debate. Paul's defense against the charge of madness or failure is not to list his intellectual achievements, his pedigree, or his follower count, so to speak. Instead, he reveals the inescapable force controlling his every move.
Okay.
This brings us to the first clause of verse 14, where he states, "For the love of Christ constrains us." He is telling the Corinthians, I am not driven by the things that drive your super apostles. I am not driven by a desire for cash, for applause, for social status, or for a comfortable life.
Now, when we hear the phrase the love of Christ, our modern minds immediately go to a very sentimental place. we think of our own warm, fuzzy feelings toward Jesus.
Right.
We think about singing a slow worship song and feeling a subjective rush of emotion.
Right.
But the treatises we are studying insist we have to look at the Greek grammar here to understand what Paul is actually saying.
Yeah.
Because it is not about our feelings at all.
You are hitting on a crucial grammatical distinction. The phrase in the original text is agape to Christou. The scholars unpacking this text classify it as a subjective genitive.
Wait, hold on. A subjective genitive. Give that to me in plain English. We aren't all Greek grammarians. Are you saying Paul is talking about an action Jesus performs, not an emotion Paul feels?
Yes, that is spot on. Let's break it down. An objective genitive would mean Paul is talking about his love for Christ, his own internal emotional affection directed toward Jesus as the object.
Okay.
If that were the case, Paul would be saying, my intense love for Jesus is what keeps me going. But a subjective genitive means Christ is the subject performing the action. It is Christ's love for Paul.
Wow.
But extension, it is Christ's sovereign, electing love for his chosen people, decreed from eternity past. Paul is not talking about the believer's weak, fickle, fluctuating affection. I mean, our love for God wanes when we get tired, hungry, or discouraged.
So true.
Paul is pointing to an objective, historical reality, the love that Christ demonstrated in a specific historical action.
That makes a massive difference. Because if my ministry or my Christian life is fueled by my love for Jesus, the moment I have a bad week, the whole engine stalls out.
Exactly.
But if the engine is his love for me, it doesn't matter how tired I am. And that love does something very specific to Paul. The English translation says it constrains us. But reading through the research on the Greek verb here, it seems like the English word constrain is way too polite. What is the word, and how do people in the first century actually use it in everyday language?
The Greek verb is syneke, derived from the root word syneko. This is a highly specific, intense word. To get the full picture, we have to look at its secular use in Greco-Roman literature. The historian Polybius utilized this exact verb to describe a military maneuver.
A military maneuver?
Yeah. He used it to describe an army being hemmed in by an enemy force in a narrow mountain pass. Picture a phalanx of soldiers compressed together in a ravine with steep cliffs on either side.
Oh, wow.
There is no possibility of retreat, no room to break formation, and no alternate route. You can only move in one direction. Additionally, the ancient medical writer Galen used syneke to describe a severe physical disease or a raging fever that entirely grips a patient's body, taking total control of their physical faculties.
It's not a gentle nudge.
Not at all. It carries the idea of holding together, compressing, gripping tightly, or completely dominating.
A disease. An army closing in. I'll be honest, if we are hemmed in like an army trapped in a narrow canyon, doesn't that make the Christian life sound terribly claustrophobic?
It can sound that way, yes.
Is this some sort of divine micromanagement? It sounds like we are losing our free will and being forced into a tunnel against our wishes. That doesn't sound like the freedom we hear so much about in church.
I understand why it sounds that way to the modern ear, but we have to contrast syneke with other Greek words Paul could have chosen but deliberately avoided.
Like what?
Well, he did not use anakazai, which denotes external coercion or physical violence to force someone against their will. He also avoided biazetai, which implies forced entry, violation, or raw compulsion. Syneke operates differently.
How so?
It acts as a protective, unyielding wall. Christ's love acts as a barrier that shuts down all alternate routes of self-advancement, leaving the believer with a single, restricted track of absolute devotion. It is not claustrophobic micromanagement. It is a rescue operation.
Explain that. How is being trapped in a canyon a rescue operation?
Well, to the unregenerate mind, having endless options to pursue fleshly desires feels like freedom. We think freedom is the ability to do whatever we want, whenever we want. But the theological reality argues that this supposed freedom is actually a cruel tyranny.
Because we just make terrible choices.
Right. We are slaves to our own scattered, destructive, and contradictory desires. If left to our own open-ended choices, we will consistently choose things that destroy us. The love of Christ hems us in. It arrests us by grace. It closes off the destructive paths so that living for anything other than the glory of Christ becomes an impossibility.
Ah, I see.
It is the only true freedom because it binds us to the very purpose for which we were created. You are not being forced against your regenerated will. Your will has been renewed so that you now gladly run down the only path that leads to life, protected by the walls of his love on either side.
I see. It's like a parent putting up guardrails on a steep mountain road. The child might complain that they can't drive their toy car off the cliff, feeling restricted, but the restriction is the only thing keeping them alive.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
So what does this all mean for how Paul makes his daily decisions? Because this intense, gripping, constraining love might sound like a mystical, purely emotional experience, like he is just caught up in a spiritual trance, just floating along on a vibe.
Which is what his opponents were doing.
Right, which ironically is what the super apostles were claiming to have.
Yeah.
But Paul immediately anchors this constraint in cold, hard, intellectual logic.
Yes, the constraint of Christ's love is not a mindless mystical impulse. It's not a blind leap into the dark. Paul writes, because we thus judge. The Greek phrase centers on the word krinantes.
And what does that word mean in this context? Let's avoid the dry textbook definitions and talk about the action behind it.
Sure. Krinantes is a legal, intellectual term. It points to a settled, definitive, rational evaluation of theological truth. Picture a judge in a courtroom.
Okay, I am picturing the judge.
The judge has listened to the testimonies, examined the forensic evidence, weighed the facts against the law, and finally brought down the gavel to declare a binding, unchangeable verdict. That is what Paul is doing.
So it is a calculated conclusion?
Yes. His radical lifestyle, his willingness to suffer beatings, his bivocational labor, his absolute devotion, none of it is a spontaneous emotional reaction. All of it is fueled by this cognitive deduction. True devotion requires heavy doctrinal reasoning. His affections are disciplined by objective truth.
I want to pause here because this is huge. We have to look at how modern religious movements often get this entirely backward. Based on the material we are reviewing, there is a stark, jarring contrast between Paul's cognitive, doctrine-driven devotion and what we see in a lot of contemporary church settings.
Oh, absolutely.
Take the seeker-sensitive movement, for example. In many of those environments, the entire architecture of the Sunday service is designed to manufacture emotional highs and prioritize psychological comfort.
It is very heavily engineered.
Yeah, the dim lighting, the specific chord progressions played on the keyboard underneath the pastor's voice, the therapeutic self-help rhetoric. It is all engineered to make the attendee feel good about themselves without demanding any rigorous intellectual engagement with historical theology.
That is a very accurate assessment of the modern landscape. The goal in those environments is often to bypass the intellect to achieve a desired emotional state.
Right.
The material also critiques the charismatic movement on similar grounds. In those circles, there is often a heavy reliance on subjective, mystical experiences, claims of continuing tongues, and supposedly new extra-biblical revelations.
Which goes back to the super apostles.
Right. The underlying assumption is that to be truly spiritual, you have to turn off your brain. You have to bypass the intellect and operate purely on feeling or direct mystical downloads. But Paul is saying the exact opposite. His heart burns with passion specifically because his mind has been captured by the objective logic of a historical event.
Right. It's not that he lacks emotion. It's that his emotion is the caboose, and the intellect is the engine. The engine pulls the train.
That is it. A church moved solely by atmosphere or manufactured emotion might be excited for a season, but it will not endure suffering. When real persecution or tragedy hits, the fog machine and the chord progressions offer no solid ground.
They just evaporate.
Yeah. A church constrained by objective truth will stand firm. We must also situate this specific verse within its broader literary context in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul places the statement about constraining love right between two massive theological realities.
What are they?
Just a few verses prior, in verses 10 and 11, he speaks of the fear of the judgment seat of Christ, knowing that all must appear before him to give an account.
Okay.
Then, just after our passage, in verses 16 through 21, he details the cosmic reality of the new creation and the ministry of reconciliation. The fear of God and the love of Christ work together simultaneously.
So they balance each other out.
Yes. The fear of future judgment guards against triviality and casual, flippant religion. The constraint of Christ's love guards against cold, legalistic formalism. The intellect grasps both of these realities, and the necessary result is a life completely poured out for the gospel.
Okay, so if his radical, controversial life is fueled by a logical, courtroom-style deduction, what is the specific historical truth Paul has logically deduced? What is the verdict he handed down with the gavel?
It is the legal transaction of the cross.
Right, he writes that as one died for all, then we're all dead.
And this brings us to the very root of Reformed soteriology, the concepts of substitutionary atonement and federal representation. Paul states that one died for all. The Greek preposition used here is hyper, which means in the place of or on behalf of. The theological treatises stress heavily that Christ's death was not an exemplary death.
Let's clarify that. What do you mean by exemplary?
Well, an exemplary death is when someone dies as a martyr to inspire others to live better lives. Think of a political dissident standing in front of a tank, or someone dying for a noble cause.
Like a hero.
Yeah. When a martyr dies, the people watching might feel motivated, they might feel a surge of courage, but they do not legally die with the martyr. Their legal status remains unchanged. Christ's death was not a tragic accident or just a dramatic display of dedication. It was a legal substitutionary transaction.
I want to make sure we really grasp the mechanics of this because it is staggering. Let's build an analogy. Think about a legal representative in a high-stakes scenario. Imagine an ambassador sent to negotiate a binding treaty on behalf of a nation.
Okay.
Two nations are at war, and the conflict is devastating. The ambassador goes to the rival capital, he signs a document of surrender, pays reparations, and signs a new treaty of allegiance. The moment that ambassador's pen hits the paper, the status of every single citizen in his home nation is legally altered. Instantly, a citizen might be asleep in their bed hundreds of miles away. They might wake up the next morning feeling exactly the same as they did the day before. They might not even know the treaty was signed yet. But legally, objectively, their reality has changed. The war is over. Their citizenship requirements have changed. What the representative does automatically and unavoidably alters the status of those they represent, regardless of the citizen's feelings or awareness at that exact moment.
That analogy perfectly captures the theology of the second Adam, which is the framework Paul is operating within. We have to look back to the covenant of works in the Garden of Eden to understand this.
Take us back to Eden.
Under that original covenant, the first Adam acted as our federal representative. He underwent a period of probation. When he broke the law of God, he failed as our representative. His failure plunged all of his posterity, the entire human race descending from him by ordinary generation, into ruin, sin, and death. Because he represented us legally, his fall was our fall. His guilt was imputed to us.
Which is why humans are born with a sinful nature. We don't just become sinners when we tell our first lie at age 3. We are born legally guilty and corrupt because our representative failed.
Correct. Now, under the covenant of grace, Christ steps into history as the second Adam. He is the perfect federal head of his chosen people. He succeeds everywhere the first Adam failed. Through his active obedience, he perfectly fulfills all the righteous requirements of the law.
He lived the life we couldn't live.
And through his passive obedience, his suffering and death, he pays the debt incurred by our sin. The logic of federal representation is ironclad. When a representative dies, those they represent die with them. That is why Paul can logically conclude, then we're all dead, or as more accurate modern translations render it, therefore all died.
So it's a corporate death.
Yes. The death of the one acts as the corporate execution of all whom he represented. The old covenant order of sin, condemnation, and self-rule was put to death on that cross in a definitive legal transaction.
And the treatises we are examining are very careful to draw some hard theological lines in the sand here. They explicitly refute alternative views that misinterpret this transaction. We have to discuss these because how you view this transaction literally changes your entire religion.
They meticulously refute two major alternative theological systems. First, they reject the Arminian view of a universal hypothetical atonement.
Let's define that. What does Arminianism teach about the cross?
Arminianism teaches that Christ died for every individual human being who has ever lived. However, they believe his death only made salvation possible. In that system, the cross itself does not actually save anyone outright. It merely opens a door, removes a barrier, and leaves the final deciding factor entirely up to human free will.
So it's a potential salvation, not an actual one.
Yes. But let's apply Paul's logic to that system. If Paul's logic holds, if one died for all, therefore all died, then applying all to every human would mean every human universally died to sin and is saved. That is universalism, a concept the scriptures clearly and repeatedly reject.
Right, the Bible does not teach everyone goes to heaven.
Exactly. Therefore, the all in this text refers specifically to the elect, those given to the Son by the Father from before the foundation of the world.
Okay, so if Jesus pays for a sin, that sin is paid for. It cannot be punished twice, once on the cross and once in hell. Therefore, he must have died specifically to actually secure the salvation of a specific people. What is the second view the text refutes?
The second is the Roman Catholic view of legalistic moralism. In that framework, justification is viewed as a lifelong, cooperative process. It is fueled by infused grace received through the sacraments, where human effort and merit must combine with Christ's sacrifice to eventually achieve justification.
So it's a team effort in that view.
Basically. But against both the Arminian and the Catholic views, the text affirms definite atonement. Christ actually, objectively, and fully secured the salvation of his sheep. His death was an actual corporate execution of the old self for his elect, securing their redemption and right standing before God without any reliance whatsoever on human cooperation or potential.
So the corporate execution at the cross was not just a transaction to save people from hell so they could go on living however they wanted on earth. It had a specific, non-negotiable target. And that target was the death of human autonomy. This brings us to the teleological goal in verse 15. What was the purpose of this execution?
Verse 15 reads, "So that those who live might no longer live for themselves." The phrase "so that" indicates the purposeful design of redemption. Christ did not die a random death, nor did he die just to give us a second chance to try harder. He died with a specific objective.
And what is that objective?
Well, the text uses a negative prohibition with the word maketi, meaning no longer. And it uses a dative of advantage with the word hutoi, meaning for their own benefit.
Let's ground that in daily life. What does it look like to live for your own benefit?
The natural, unregenerate life is entirely self-directed. We seek our own benefit in everything. We seek our own glory, our own comfort, our own financial security, our own reputation. Even our seemingly altruistic acts are often tainted by a desire to be seen as good people. The design of the atonement was to eradicate that self-directed idolatry. The substitutionary death was the execution of the self-sovereign individual. You no longer have the right to wake up and say, what do I want to do with my life today?
And then Paul pivots to the positive reality. We do not just die to self and float in a vacuum. We aren't just empty vessels staring at a wall. The second half of the verse says, but for him who died and was raised in their place. This connects perfectly to Christ's dual office as priest and king.
Precisely. As our great high priest, he offered the perfect sacrifice. He shed his own blood to satisfy divine justice and reconcile us to God.
Right.
But the gospel does not end with a dead substitute hanging on a cross. By rising from the dead, he ascends as king. He is the sovereign monarch over his purchased possession. The resurrection establishes his living, continuous, unyielding claim over his people. You do not belong to yourself because you were bought with a price by a priest, and you now live under the absolute monarchy of a resurrected king.
This absolutely shatters a modern fallacy that is so prevalent today, the idea of carnal Christianity. This is the belief that someone can pray a sinner's prayer, accept Jesus as their savior to get their fire insurance and stay out of hell, but completely reject his absolute monarchy over their daily choices.
Right. They want the benefits without the submission.
Yeah, they want the pardon from the judge, but they want to keep the deed to their own life. They want to be the CEO of their existence and just keep Jesus on retainer as a consultant they call when things get tough. The sources we're studying argue this is a complete impossibility.
It is entirely impossible.
The very mechanism that saves you from hell is the exact same mechanism that executes your autonomy. You cannot have one without the other.
To claim the benefits of Christ's death while refusing the claim of his lordship is to entirely misunderstand Paul's gospel. You cannot slice Jesus in half. You cannot take Jesus the Savior and reject Jesus the Lord. The grace that justifies is the exact same grace that trains the redeemed to deny ungodliness and live for the King. It is an inseparable package.
I know the material also touches on the dispensational framework regarding this lordship. Can you briefly touch on that, keeping it accessible for someone who might not be a seminary graduate?
Sure. The texts point out that this resurrected lordship is currently realized in the church, which is his spiritual body, made up of both Jews and Gentiles who believe. However, this is distinct from ethnic Israel's future national restoration.
Why is that distinction necessary?
Recognizing this distinction guards against replacement theology, which incorrectly assumes the church has entirely replaced Israel in all of God's prophetic promises. Christ rules his church now as head and Lord, but he will also fulfill his literal national promises to Israel in the future.
Let's shift gears a bit. This massive concept of a representative dying and rising to claim a people is not just some new theology Paul invented on the spot to win an argument with the super apostles in Corinth. This is the climax of the entire biblical narrative.
Absolutely.
We have to look at the Old Testament background to see how deep these roots go.
The substitutionary logic of 2 Corinthians 5.14-15 is the fulfillment of the ancient sacrificial system established centuries prior. Consider the Passover lamb in the book of Exodus.
Right, the first Passover.
The blood of the lamb applied to the doorpost of the house shielded the inhabitants from the judgment of God passing through Egypt. Or look at the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16.
Walk us through that. What actually happened on the Day of Atonement?
The high priest would take 2 goats. One goat was slaughtered. Its blood was carried into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled on the mercy seat to appease God's wrath against the sins of the nation.
Okay, so that deals with the wrath.
Yes. The other goat, the scapegoat, was kept alive. The high priest would lay his hands on its head, symbolically transferring the guilt of the people onto the animal, and then it was driven out into the desolate wilderness, carrying the sins away.
Wow.
These were shadows, ancient object lessons proving 2 unalterable realities. First, that guilt required the shedding of blood, sin demands death, and second, that access to God required a substitute acting in the place of the guilty.
I think a lot of modern believers struggle with this. If the Day of Atonement and all those ancient bloody sacrifices were just shadows pointing to this one moment on the cross, how should a modern believer read those dense chapters in Leviticus today?
That is a great question.
Because when someone is doing a Bible in a Year reading plan, and they hit mid-February, and they are trudging through endless descriptions of kidney fat and sprinkling blood, what should they be looking for?
They should look at those chapters through the lens of the threefold office of Christ: prophet, priest, and king. When you read of the blood on the altar, you are seeing Christ the priest offering himself as the perfect, once-for-all sacrifice, a reality the blood of bulls and goats could never fully accomplish.
Right.
When you read the meticulous, exacting laws of purity, you see Christ the prophet who perfectly reveals the holy standard of God. And when you see the ordering of the camp, the positioning of the tribes around the tabernacle, you see Christ the king who organizes, rules, and dwells in the midst of his redeemed people.
That makes those chapters so much more vibrant. It's not just ancient butcher instructions, it's a portrait of Jesus. And the text also connects Paul's words to the prophet Isaiah, right?
Yes, specifically Isaiah 53. Christ is the righteous suffering servant who was wounded for our transgressions, who was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. The Father did not just observe human violence against Jesus and decide to turn it into a good lesson after the fact.
It wasn't an accident.
No, it was the eternal counsel and predetermined plan of God for the Son to willingly substitute himself to satisfy divine justice and secure his sheep.
We have covered a massive amount of theological ground here, but we must take this towering theological reality out of the first century, out of the academic realm, and drop it squarely into the daily lives, the corporate church structures, and the personal sufferings of the believers listening right now.
We have to apply it.
Let's start with the corporate church. Based on everything we've discussed about the cross-executing human autonomy, the text issues a strong critique regarding how we actually do church today.
A church focused on the self, which is the antithesis of Paul's message, will inevitably fracture. It will splinter over personal preferences, stylistic disagreements, and social ambitions. It turns corporate worship into a consumer performance.
Give me an example of what that looks like in a modern congregation.
Well, it looks like attendees sitting in the pews, evaluating the music, the lighting, and the preaching based entirely on how it made them feel. Did I get anything out of that? Was the pastor engaging enough? Was the music in my preferred style?
Like a Yelp review for Sunday morning?
Exactly. The text demands corporate repentance from this mindset. It requires a return to faithful expository preaching. The pulpit should confront the intellect and the conscience with the objective text of Scripture, not coddle the ego. It demands strict confessional commitments from elders to guard against theological drift. And it requires a total rejection of pragmatic, marketing-driven strategies that try to sell the gospel like a retail product. The church is a gathered body of executed and resurrected individuals worshiping their monarch, not a retail outlet distributing religious goods for consumers.
That is a tough pill to swallow for a culture obsessed with church growth metrics. But it brings up a practical question about how we pursue obedience. If we are not earning our salvation through our works, and if the old self is dead, why do we strive for holiness? Why try to be good? The treatises point to the third use of the law. Explain this concept for us.
The theological framework of the Reformation outlines 3 uses of the moral law. The first use is pedagogical. It acts as a mirror to show us our sin, prove we cannot save ourselves, and drive us to Christ.
Okay, that makes sense.
The second use is civil. It restrains evil in broader society through the threat of punishment. But the third use of the law is normative for the believer. It teaches that while the law cannot justify us, it cannot save us, it remains the perfect objective guide for how to please the God who has already saved us.
So it's the instruction manual for the new life.
That is it. Believers pursue precise obedience to God's commands, not to earn salvation, which is the definition of legalism, but out of deep, overwhelming gratitude for the sovereign grace that has already rescued them. Because the love of Christ constrains us, we look to his law to know how to direct our new resurrected lives in a way that honors the King.
Let's apply this to the listener who is enduring hidden, grinding suffering. Maybe someone is listening to this right now while dealing with a chronic autoimmune illness, profound loneliness, or unrewarded, exhausting labor taking care of an aging parent.
Yeah.
When the visible metrics of their life look like failure, when they look a lot more like Paul being beaten than the super apostles flying first class, how does this text sustain them?
Well, Paul's entire apostolic life was marked by extreme affliction, constant misunderstanding, and severe physical weakness. If he had measured God's love for him by his earthly ease, his physical comfort, or his bank account, he would have despaired entirely.
He would have quit.
He would have. The believer must not measure Christ's love by their current circumstances. The love of Christ is an objective, historical reality eternally demonstrated at the cross. The Savior who died for them now lives for them. Therefore, they can persevere in the dark seasons, they can forgive costly wounds from others, and they can labor in total obscurity, knowing that their life is legally hidden with Christ. The risen King sees the hidden labor, he sustains the weary sufferer, and he will vindicate his faithful servants in the end.
This theology completely flips the script on modern therapy culture. I want to point this out because it is so pervasive. We're constantly bombarded with messages, even from Christian counselors sometimes, about setting boundaries, protecting your peace, manifesting your truth, and centering yourself.
Oh, constantly.
The highest virtue in our culture is self-care and self-actualization. But the gospel steps in and says, no, you died. Your digital habits, your bank account, your calendar, your body, they do not belong to you anymore.
Right.
They are not yours to center. They belong to a risen King. You do not need to center yourself. You need to be entirely decentered, revolving entirely around the Son of God.
To live for self is actual slavery disguised as modern freedom. To be constrained by Christ's love, to live entirely for him who died and rose again, is the only true freedom. The world says find yourself. Christ says lose your life for my sake and find it.
Let's summarize the massive progression we have covered today.
Yeah.
We moved from the hyper-competitive pagan culture of Corinth and the vain, money-hungry boasting of the super apostles.
Yeah.
We saw how Paul bypassed their games and pointed to the unyielding, constraining wall of Christ's sovereign love. We unpacked the rigorous doctrinal logic of federal headship, where the legal execution of the cross shatters human autonomy. And we arrived at the absolute monarchy of the resurrected King, who claims every square inch of the believer's existence.
It is a totalizing reality that leaves absolutely no room for neutrality. The old self is dead, the new life is purchased, and the direction is permanently fixed on the glory of the Redeemer.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. This is something we haven't explicitly stated, but that builds directly on everything we've discussed about the Greek verb syneke.
Yeah.
If the love of Christ truly operates as a restricting, unavoidable force, like an army boxing you into a narrow mountain pass to protect you, could it be that your periods of intense spiritual wandering or rebellion are actually the moments when that love is actively keeping you from utterly destroying yourself?
That is a fascinating way to look at it.
Think about it. Are the massive frustrations, the sudden career failures, and the seemingly unfair closed doors in your life actually the very walls of his constraining love that you're stubbornly bumping your head against? Thank you for taking this deep dive into the source material on Reformed thinking.